First of all, I'd like to thank the Academy for the splendid invitation to join with you and talk these things through, actually to listen to talk about these things. And Chancellor and President for your hospitality and understanding is fantastic. Professor Donati sent me the question. I want to be clear. And I have to say it is an extremely difficult question, not just for the content, but for the place of geography where the answer is to be given, the UK. There are two aspects of legislation. One is what is legislation, and the question, as you rightly say, Chairman, how do we define family friendly? And rather than read my paper, which you could read, I thought I would expose, if you like, or transmit some of the thoughts that went through my head in the processes of trying to answer a difficult question at a delicate and difficult time. To sum up, the transition from a Christian-dominated and influential paradigm to a skepticism, a secularization, if you like, but also what I pick up from other speakers, and a meddling that comes with political interventions, maybe well-intentioned, maybe with good moral values behind them, but nevertheless political interventions into our everyday life, which help to define for us issues which are not necessarily discussed in a moral or philosophical or intellectual way. Policymaking has become the creature of politics, just as legislation is the outcome of the politics. So I begin by asking myself some questions. It's easy to ask questions, but more difficult to find the answers. But the question I ask is legislation in the United Kingdom based on Christian moral values? And the reason I can ask this question is because United Kingdom is one of the outliers of our constitutional settlements, a bit like Paolo's inquisitive question over what the constitutions tell us. Well, he will know that, unlike many other countries, the United Kingdom has an established church. There's not a separation between church and state. The upper chamber has members of the spiritual variety, as they're called, as members, and they have equal rights to pass legislation. And the Queen is not just the head of state, but she is also the head of the Church of England. And that is a very important combination of answering our question by saying, yes, Christian moral thinking has had and continues to have an influence, not maybe the influence, in the way legislation is passed. And I cite at the beginning a judge who basically summed it up: to promote virtue and morality, to discourage vice and immorality, and to, as it were, represent Christian values or beliefs, whatever that may mean. Not clear, but this is a judge speaking in a case about moral failings and so on. And even the Book of Common Prayer, which is not a legal text, can be cited in aid of a particular argument. So it's quite clear that the influence of Christianity shaped Western family law. And in my attempt to understand this, I, of course, would look at family law books. That's where one would go to find out where family law comes from. Well, this is an educational moment, Jeffrey, because they don't. So the educational paradigm, educode, to lead out, to explain, begins with the explanation of what the law is, but not why the law is informed by moral issue. It has been, as it were, bowdlerized from the versions of textbooks, but even there, it was never part of them. So one looks then at the works of St. Augustine, and I trace very briefly through, and believe it or not, the Roman lawyers are important, because Justinian's codes are read, were influential in England, and many jurists, they call themselves Roman lawyers, not Roman Catholic lawyers, but Roman lawyers. And of course, I dropped the point that there was, of course, canon law, which is not even talked about very much in public, but it existed as a private matter, because family law was always defined as a private law matter in England, up until relatively recently, that is. So therefore, in that respect, these texts, Justinian and canon law, were used as aids in interpretation. There's no doubt about that. St. Thomas Aquinas is exceptionally important because of the monogamous family relationship, the issue of sacramental theology and natural law, bringing it together. And of course, dare I say it, popes have contributed to this. And I have to say, it's a positive contribution, though not read very much or even understood very much in the literacy of legal thinking. Legal jurisprudence redacts that part. Yes, Martin Luther had his part in our Reformation, but the Reformation came about more because of a split between arguments between monarchy and papacy. Was it a theological break? Well, in part, of course, it was. The theology diverged, the moment of divergence. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that the Anglo-Catholic tradition is born out of this, where there are synergies, shall we say, not necessarily papal authority, but synergies between the two. And in my paper, I show how successive popes, including Pope Francis, who has, I think, been a wonderful and positive influence in refreshing what it is to be Christian and refreshing the enthusiasm for Christian thinking. So to sum up, yes, we come to a moment where legislation, which I'll define in a second, is definitely a secular activity. But I am not of the view that the Christianity part, the values, the morality, is in fact expunged from that legislative process. And there are examples where I think one could be encouraged, as well as examples where one would be discouraged. But I don't think it's the end of Christianity in an influence, though I think some people confuse the beliefs and the religion from institutions that may be fading from time to time or losing their influence. I think that is part of an ecclesiastical issue, but not the only one. Moral issues come from people from within, as we heard from Archbishop yesterday. The idea of a spirituality of moral right and wrong, that has not in any way been negotiated away by Parliament, President or Queen, or any tradition. It is in part of our responsibilities as citizens. So I am optimistic that despite the fact that churches may not define our legislation in terms of family law, they certainly have an influence. And if you want to look at the main influences today, I think if you read pages 7 to 10, you'd see that we've moved from the sort of ecclesiastical thinking to writing that comes from people like Montesquieu, John Locke, and of course Bentham. So if you wanted an understanding, a DNA, if you like, of what it is to enforce public morals or to debate about public morals, then that is a rich seam on which to build. But it is not the same thing as a Christian set of values. It is an interpretation of those values or an extension of them. In other words, a sort of positivistic normativism, if you like, where you bring together value judgments in a sort of rather globule way. Some of it works, some of it doesn't. Now we come to how we define family-friendly. Well, in one way, I can pass the buck to Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Pache, your point about the international rules and so on, but that for us is not domestic law. So in terms of domestic UK law, I'm on safe ground to call the convention because it's part of our system under the Human Rights Act. So it has an influence, but I don't think it is as influential as many people would hope or would believe it. So to summarize, we're now moving to what might be defined as examples of or areas where family-friendly legislation can be found or discovered. And in many ways, it's part of the Catholic mission of defining the needs of the poor, to put it very simply, over the lobbying of the rich. And in that way, the Catholic Church and many Christian churches have a sotto voce. They have a single voice, which is inspiring and compelling. It may not be influential, but believe me, it is what many of my students passionately believe in. So there's an optimism in this, because they know very well that the pursuit of happiness in the Benthamite theorem is not necessarily rewarded by the riches of money and wealth. It's the personal integrity of belief and of moral judgment. They do want to have happy lives. They do want to have families. Most of them want to be in a relationship that is both dependable, predictable, and, dare I say it, loving. They will not ask you how they can love someone, but they may ask, how do I talk to a girl or a boy? How do I talk to, a girl talk to a boy and so on, vice versa? That is a very common issue because many of them don't talk anymore. They use their machine, they text each other, which is not the same. So we come to the issues of social economic setting. Rather bravely, I thought I'd give something which on the surface looks rather cruel, on page 10. The government decided in its wisdom that too much money was going into child benefits. Take a note here, child benefits supplied many one-parent families with that margin of economic independence that took them from poverty into just surviving. The government had this idea, we must cut down, too much money, public expenditure moments when, you can get the budget through on the basis of cutting it, not spending on it. So the idea was that if you had a benefit over the second child, it would be cut, which is a kind of don't have too many children moment. And it was hoped because the result would be people would stop having many more children, therefore everyone wins. That was the crudity of it. It was a saving money thing. The Institute for Fiscal Studies just a few days ago published some information analysis to show people just had more children when they felt that that was part of the loving relationship that deserved children. And all it did was make people poorer, which goes back to an earlier point that very often, as Stefano pointed out, what appears to be family friendly or for the family is not for the family at all, it's something else. But let's not forget the work's been done on child support, on child vulnerability, and so on. And here, when Jeffrey Sachs gives such a good talk on education, I had a little bit of a panic. And I went back to my paper, did I mention education? Well, yes, Jeffrey, I did, but maybe not as well as I should have. And here's the point. On page 12, I make this issue. The government made a decision on economics to reduce the amount of money that would be available for school meals because of the pandemic and so on. And guess what? They didn't realize that education, including feeding the kids, this is like, basic thinking. And so a very famous footballer of a team I certainly don't support, football, by the way, in this context, soccer. In England, it's ambiguously defined as rugby. Anyway, it's soccer. He was very annoyed about this because he realized that this was a moment when many kids would be in poverty, i.e. would be hungry, would not be able to survive without the school meals they would have got if they'd gone to school. So there was a hoo-ha over it, and I'm glad to tell you, public opinion went in the other direction. In other words, the moral issues were to support the family. Now, this brings me to family mediation. Why does it bring me to family mediation? Well, the reason is because family law is too often a crude operation of complicated rules that have to apply when families are breaking up or when there's matrimonial disagreements and there has to be a separation. And I know, because I have a very distinguished judge in the audience, and I know I could never do his job because it is both exhausting, intellectually complex and difficult, and I know that judges like him do it day in, day out, without any real support systems to make it possible, and they do a valiant job. One of the reasons I bring this up is because I was given the job in England, not in Northern Ireland or Scotland or Wales, to look at the question of family mediation. If I were to rewrite the history, the legal history of England, I would plea that family law would be integral to the understanding of jurisprudence. And I would then argue that if family law is integral to the public understanding of jurisprudence, and therefore students should learn about morality, I would also argue that courts that are family law courts should have mediation at the center. And mediation is a voluntary system that allows trained volunteers, but now more professionally organized, to give advice to try and find a solution to the conflicts that arise in family disputes. In that context, my report faced a dilemma. I was being pressed by many to include legislation at the end of it, to produce another act of parliament which would bring mediation into the family court system in all sorts of ways. Actually, that's not what would happen. It's already happened in law. What that was code for doing was to create a regulatory structure in statutory law to regulate mediators in a way that the legal profession could live at night, because they would then know that competition would not exactly be fair or equal, because they could continue to give legal advice, not necessarily mediation advice. You can see the argument. I resisted that argument on two grounds. One, that I thought the delay in legislation, but more particularly the political interventions in it, was too great a risk to take. And secondly, I could not wait until legislation took place. So I recommended, and I'm glad to say it's been implemented, a structure for training and education of mediators that would create the standards of a profession that was only an embryo, a profession. In other words, a set regulatory system that was toughened up with rules and regulations that could be policed and looked at, but not necessarily on the basis of a legal regime. So if I were to dream a dream, it would be that the mediation system would be center stage, the resources given to it, both to adjudicate, to mediate in the sense of producing outcomes that protect the vulnerable, that give some power to the powerless and some voice to the children. Judge Marnin, who I mentioned earlier on, he rightly pointed out, and I think it's a very important point, that the courts in England have, and in Northern Ireland, have been very good in encouraging a form of guardian ad litem, generally described, but basically a system of the voice for the child in the court. And that, I think, is really family-friendly legislation, that they have a voice and they have a protection. Domestic abuse is something that is difficult to talk about, but it's something that we have to recognize, that if the law is to address family issues, it must take seriously the abuse that is at the heart of some of the conflicts that are in fact being played out. The statistics are truly staggering of the amount of abuse that goes on within families and so on. I touched very briefly on the complicated areas of trafficking and modern slavery. When I wrote the paper, it was before the ghastly war in Ukraine, but I would have included that as an issue about how victims are best dealt with. But I would argue that the Modern Slavery Act, which was passed by Mrs. May's government, was an embryo of giving families, children, and so on, rights and obligations that would, in fact, help them to get to where they needed to get to and give some degree of protection. So we come, as it were, to draw together the disparate parts of this discussion. It's very, very difficult to know to what extent family-friendly legislation will be an autonomous part of our system, because Parliament, in a sense, is a political institution as well as a legal one. And it's quite clear that the politics of the family, rhetorical, polemical, are wrapped up with disputes we've just heard about, left and right, political arguments. And what I think is needed is a recognition that at the heart of those debates and discussions, there has to be a voice, the moral compass that may accompany the outcome. And I think Christianity is the most promising way of that voice being heard. There are other religious groups will similarly do the same. But in this context, I think religious voluntary groups and so on really have to come to terms that if they are to succeed, they have to occupy the field that is currently occupied by the newspapers, the media, and the polemical discussion. They've got to be able to join into that debate, engage in the discussion, and take forward some of the issues you've been hearing about over the last couple of days, i.e., find a way of communicating, but also educating the future generation of what it's like to be human in a complex world where climate change, COVID-19, and now the Ukraine war question the validity of our entitlement to believe that civilization can continue unchanged. That is the arrogance of humans, that we think that we are entitled to go forward, when in fact we may not have that entitlement. Certainly many of our people in this country and in the world cannot assume these things. They've got to recognize that we have got to stand up for peace, we've got to stand up for reconciliation, and in things like financial aid for overseas and dealing with refugees, this is at the cusp of where our humanity joins the global world, and where we should be tested as to what it is and what it means to be Christian and what it means to be engaged in a moral dispute. The inevitability is we might lose the argument, but we will not lose the debate. Arguments can be won and lost. The debate should go on. And I think listening to the Pope this morning, and indeed the Prime Minister of Italy, I was very moved by the thought that we can't give up. We have to continue on in the belief that our Christianity has enormous potential to provide a better future for all of mankind. And although it's taken a while to get there in the argument, the pathway and the beginning must be to educate the lawyers. The family law is in a set of rules and regulations, to educate our government and our leaders that, in fact, values, not populism or polemics, values have to be discussed, and they have no monopoly. They think they have because they're successfully able to engage with the polemics of politics. We have to be quite able to articulate our beliefs with the knowledge that in the end it defines not just what family-friendly legislation is, but what we are ourselves. Okay, that's it.